To give you a little bit of context, I think most of you know ActionAid, so this might be a little redundant, but I'll introduce for any of you who are not familiar with ActionAid. We are an international network building a just, equitable, and sustainable world in solidarity with communities on the front lines of poverty and injustice. We work in more than 50 countries to achieve social justice, gender equality, and poverty eradication. And one of the main focuses of our work is to shift power away from elites and toward communities. So today we are going to talk about disasters and emergencies and how both the pandemic and climate change and shrinking political space is exacerbating folks who are dispossessed and displaced as a result of protracted emergencies that have been taking place for several years. And we have with us two incredible speakers, Farah Kabir from ActionAid Bangladesh and Yolette Etienne from ActionAid Haiti to talk about their context. So in Haiti, Hurricane Matthew struck in 2016, making it the strongest storm to hit Haiti in 50 years. It wreaked havoc on the country, and the country is still reeling, while the country was still reeling from the impacts of a 2010 earthquake. In Bangladesh, the crisis we're going to address there is that 700,000 Rohingya people fled persecution in Myanmar and sought refuge in the neighboring country in Bangladesh. And both our speakers have been leading the response on the ground, shifting power and protecting human rights of communities who have been affected in partnership with them and helping them build back from these crises. The reason that we wanted to talk about this in our second installment of this webinar is to talk about how the coronavirus pandemic has accelerated existing displacement, dispossession, and economic downturn. In Haiti, political space is shrinking while authoritarian pressures from the government grow. In Bangladesh, the future of the Rohingya refugees remains highly uncertain despite years and years of pushing for the recognition of their status. So we thought this would be a moment to bring these two stories together and share experience and talk together about these crises that are happening in opposite ends of the world. In terms of the roadmap, just to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing, we're going to start with a little bit of interactive work for everybody, just for a few minutes. And then we'll have a conversation between the speakers for about 50 minutes. And then we'll open up the floor for questions and further discussion, and then come back to collective reflection and action before we close. And again, a reminder to hold your questions for the panelists until we open the floor for questions. So before we dive in and hear from our brilliant speakers, we want to do a little activity. One is a word cloud and one is a poll. So we're going to start with the word cloud. And you'll see in the chat that there will be a link posted to Slido with a code, slido.com, that you can go and do this particular activity. And the first thing that we're going to do is a word cloud where you can identify the top issues that you are talking about in your daily conversations. It can be absolutely anything, but whatever the top issues you're talking about, just take a moment and go to the Slido link and type in whatever it is that's on your mind.
I can't do it.
All right, so far, coronavirus, elections, mobilization are cropping up. Coronavirus seems to be the big one.
Palestine. I don't know how to type it in.
Okay, thank you. Palestine. Jenna, maybe you can type that one in if possible from your end.
Thank you.
we're seeing a lot of different issues coming up: community resilience, mental health, gender-based violence, racial justice, food insecurity, civic engagement, public services. Yeah, I can see all the issue folks here. Yes, it does. US elections. Now that's the big one. Yes, I definitely can relate to that. All right. Yeah, we've got 17. That's good. That's pretty close. Great. Thank you for participating in that. Clearly, the pandemic and US elections are the things that seem to be foremost folks' minds. Now we want to move a little bit closer to the topic at hand, and just want to take a little bit of a pulse of to what extent you all are familiar with either the Rohingya refugee crisis or Haiti's sociopolitical situation. So we're going to take a poll now, and there'll be a link shared. You can choose more than one answer, but just respond to the prompt however you see fit in terms of your familiarity with either of these crises. And this will help our speakers also frame what they're talking about, depending on the level of familiarity in this group. I'll just wait for a couple more to come in. It looks like we've got a pretty well-informed audience with us today, with the majority of people on the call somewhat familiar with both situations. Okay. Great, thank you for that. So moving on, let's start with some introductions of our speakers. As I mentioned before, we have Farah Kabir, who's the Executive Director of ActionAid Bangladesh with us today, and we also have Yolette Etienne, the Executive Director of ActionAid Haiti with us today. I'm going to ask Farah to just say a few words of introduction. If you can unmute, please go ahead, Farah.
Hi, thank you, Niranjani, and thank you to everyone who's here. It's wonderful to see so many people. It's night here, and our monsoon seems to go on because it's the middle of October, and most of us will attribute it to climate change and how the weather is changing and how things are happening. But this morning, I saw one of my flower pots, the flower had blossomed. I was very excited about it. I work in Dhaka, and I'm from Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Farah. Yolette, a few words of introduction.
Yes, thanks so much. I am very enthusiastic to see all these faces. And because when the situation is so critical, you feel isolated. And seeing all these faces and to talk and to discuss and to reflect on one thematic, for me, it's wonderful. Thanks to be there. And thanks to invite me to be with you.
The target list.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask anyone who is not Farah, Yolette, yourself.
Stay with you.
Because we love you. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Yolette, we're going to start with you. Can you tell us how climate, natural disasters, and human rights crises are perpetuating political extremism in Haiti at the moment, and how these crises have opened paths for authoritarian governments to exert their power?
Yeah.
Yolette, you're on mute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One thing to remember when there is big campaign about informing people about climate change, clearly Haiti was identified as one of the threatened country because we were a small country, we were an island, and of course we are going to suffer a lot about the climate change. But you know, and clearly the idea during this period, people were saying, we are suffering, we are paying, but we are not the one who polluted the climate. And do you know what happened along the years? Through different meetings and through what Haiti had to submit, now no longer we can say those who are polluting the climate, those should pay. Now we are asked in our narrative to say all of us, we need to mitigate. And now no longer this discourse, those who are most responsible should pay. And it is where we are. And no longer they say that Haiti is one of the 4 countries that will be most affected by the climate change. And every day we are suffering this, I should say. And you know, in a poor country where people, they are expecting rains for the agriculture. And now that is changing. And every year, they still start to invest in agriculture. And still, more and more, they become poorer and poorer. And they still continue to do that. And what's happening? The youth are abandoning. And in Haiti now, in the countryside, you see more motorcycles than people working in the agriculture. And still, all the country is living on agriculture. All the country, our survival is based on the work of these agricultures. So clearly, not talking about the consequences of climate change, that doesn't mean that doesn't exist. Day and day, year after year, people become poor. And still, they are talking about fatigue from donors. They are talking about this country is going no longer, nowhere. But they don't see all this impact. And what does that mean in the life of people? What about people living in a dignified life? The extent of the poverty is so unacceptable, and people is not living as people. And you know, people going, kids going in Cité Soleil, kids going in the countryside, they cannot understand they are people, they get rights. And you know what's happening with this situation where they don't learn, they don't feel they are people, they are rights. And that means also there is a sort of banalization of life. Life doesn't count because people doesn't understand what life means. People is dying, people is normal, it's about hunger is normal, people, kids not going to school is normal, not having access to health is normal, and now we are in this vicious circle. And as you know, in this, we get the earthquake in 2010, and then we just commemorate 20 years. And after 20 years, where it was told we'll be back better, and clearly we are not building back better. And of course, it's because this country is a country where people, we are Black people, we cannot organize our life, we are responsible of our situation, but you know, people feel guilty. We are guilty, we are responsible of this situation when violence is increasing, when we cannot get stability at political level, when more and more people become poor. But clearly, climate change is affecting people's life, people's health, and people's dignity. Because when a mother, when a father cannot afford to send the kids to school, when you need an ONG to give you a pack of water, to give your kid a water, when everything you need, that should be done, that should be shyly from someone else, how can you feel you are powerful? How can you feel you can change things? And in this context, clearly there are responsibility. There is big political responsibility. And of course, every time there is a right to get support from others when a disaster it. That's normal. And we as ActionAid, we continue to tell people, you know, when there is a disaster, when we get Matthew, when we get the earthquake, that's your right to get assistance from the government. That's your right for the country to get assistance from others. It's not about charity, it's your right. That means this assistance should be done respecting people's dignity, respecting people's culture, respecting people's rights, respecting people's integrity, men and women. And that's something we need to continue to tell people. They are right because they are human rights. They are human, but they have rights. That's the situation, but of course that's true. We are working in political instability, and we get with some of us, and even in Haiti, we talk about occupation. Occupation. Normally, when you get United Nations troop in your country, that could be also right because we are a member of United Nations. But we know actually it's a control, and our country doesn't control, and that didn't help neither to help to recover. And that brings other problem, other issue. Do you know, yesterday, it was 20 years when we get cholera. And it was the occupation mission minister that brings this cholera in Haiti. They spent a year before recognizing they brought cholera in this country and they need reparation. Finally, United States recognized they are responsible. But in spite they said they are responsible, people. It was 10,000 people died from cholera, more than what we get from corona during this period. But till now, people get nothing. Until now, you know, talking about climate change that is affecting water, I mentioned earlier, we are an island, a small island, and that will affect us, that will affect our level of water, that will affect the level of salinity of our water. And then we could expect in collective reparation from minister, they could help to reinstall our water system. That didn't happen. People still are collecting water from river. Kids are still collecting water from rivers and to drink this kind of water. So in Haiti, that's, you know, you have, everything is complicated at this level. And we feel this connection between what is called the international community with our political elite. And coming from the earthquake, then Matthew, then cholera, then Matthew, and now with corona. Fortunately, they were announcing big disaster, but it was to collect big money. But it seems the virus has not been so aggressive in our country, but the consequences are more at economical level, at social political level. Now, growing the gap between the people in our country. What happened, if I take an example at level of education, those who get some, parents can afford it, they get access to internet, they can access to program through internet. But the majority of our kids were completely outside of education. And you know, from the past 2 years, there was a lot of political trouble because people was mobilizing against corruption, against all of this. And again, because of this, the kids didn't go to school. Then happened corona, they continue not to go to school. And that has been for the past 2-3 years, a big gap between those who can access education and who can access later on better job, who can have other opportunity, who will leave the country because that's the dream of most of the youth. And those kids, you know, those kids in the houses, and while the parents cannot afford, cannot give them food, cannot help them for education, and living in some unacceptable space where people can live. That's the situation of the family for the first period of corona. But quicker, the population, the women mainly, they didn't stay home. It wasn't not about confinement, because all of this was set to collect money. And when this money come, and till now, there are no transparency about use of this money that come to help for coronavirus. And that will help the government to consolidate himself. And because that broke totally the mobilization. People cannot meet no longer, organization cannot communicate between themselves, and there is no longer possibility to continue to be heard, to continue to say, we don't want corruption, we want democracy, we don't want insecurity to go in insecurity, and we want that to be changed. It was wonderful. I mentioned earlier the dream of most of youth. It was to leave the country. Surprisingly, 2 years ago, we were really surprised because the youth start to show themselves. And they use internet. They start with an hashtag saying, where is the money from Petrocaribe? Petrocaribe was the money we get from Venezuela, and in many countries in Latin America, they use this money to invest in infrastructure in this country, to invest in consolidated development in this country. But in Haiti, we have nothing, and this money was robbed. And people, we were surprising, they started their campaign through internet, and then they organized sitting, and from this, it was the whole mobilization against corruption and asking for accountability from the political elite. And all of this for these 2 years, at some extent, the government was going to be dropped. But again, the international community, again, United States mainly, and the new mission of United Nations in Haiti called BIN, they were the ones supporting this corrupted government. They were the ones to show the people they are powerless. They cannot decide for their country. And of course, with Corona, all this effort to mobilize, to be heard, at least to face insecurity, to continue to say, we want that to change. It was wonderful, because before people were saying, I don't want this man, I want this other man. But from this mobilization from youth, we started to say, we want to change the system. We want to change the level of inequality. We want all Asian kids to get the same chance to become a citizen and to participate in the life of our country. Donc, the revendication changed, the claim changed completely. And that was dropped drastically with Corona. And what happened? The government, with the support of USA, with the support of the United Nations mission, they continue to impose us this government. And mainly now, they are imposing their own priority. When people, I told earlier, we didn't suffer the pandemic in terms of health, and it could be very worse because of level of our health services in the country. And I should say, maybe smiling, but clearly, at some extent, I take our traditional medicine, our herbs help us a lot. So when people started to talk about Corona, all of us, from all the social category, we start to put our tea, and drinking our herbs. And I still myself also thinks our herbs help us. And one parenthesis I should say, because we are very also affected as organization to what happened to our fellow in other countries, how that was affected in Europe, in Latin America, in United States. But this idea where they put our country, we are the poorest country, and we always need to ask for assistance, to ask for donation, and not to learn to say, we also need to share. We have also things to provide to others. We also can be in solidarity with others. It was also one point with women to WhatsApp, we also exchange. And laughing, it was saying, maybe we could send them some of our herbs to help them to cure themselves.
Thank you.
That didn't happen, but clearly we get this thought. Thanks, Naya.
Thank you.
Now I am thinking about that.
That's a sobering message. Such a sobering message, but also these points of hope. I wanted to pivot to Farah because you were talking about how powerful the mobilization that the youth did before the pandemic hit and those efforts were curbed. And I know, Farah, you have been really focused on women-led response in your country, and in particular with the Rohingya refugee crisis. Could you tell us a bit more about that and why you focus on women-led responses and how the current pandemic situation is affecting the work with Rohingya refugees?
I want to share a story with you. We had a major cyclone in 2007, and it affected the coastal communities in a major way. And, at that point, we were all trying to provide assistance and support. But even and everybody was affected in the community and in those areas. But in the midst of all this, there were 125 sex workers, and people would not allow them to move to the shelters. Even in the midst of an emergency, there is this social, taboo, and the status of women and girls are viewed, does not change. It's still in the lenses of the patriarchy and the power relations that exist in society. And when there's an emergency, it jeopardizes and it puts the women and girls in even greater vulnerability. And this is the learning of that kind of made us think that we need to focus. And as ActionAid has always been putting women at the center of its work, its approach, these learnings, and I'm sure if you talk to colleagues across the Federation, you will find there's so similar learnings of where even in a emergency, these gender based approaches, the perspectives impact on whether it is assistance or whether humanitarian aid. So this was one of the points where for us, we felt that we need to look beyond the traditional humanitarian response. And over the years, we learned a lot more by working with the communities. And the other the story I want to share with you that, the Rohingyas, when the Rohingyas have been unfortunately been persecuted over decades. And in 81, 82, they are an ethnic minority in Myanmar, which was previously known as Burma. And they're a Muslim minority. And in Myanmar, they were stripped of their citizenship in 81, 82. And the rest of the world remains silent because Myanmar has resources. So there's a geopolitical aspect to it where Myanmar is important to some of the powerhouses in Asia, and its resources has been of greater importance than what happens to communities, and Myanmar has multiple ethnic communities. So the persecution of the Rohingyas is not something new, but it has been happening over decades. What kind of brought attention to it is in 2017, the number of people who had to flee. The persecution in the Rakhine state took such a proportion, and the genocide that was committed, that kind of put the spotlight on the Rohingyas. And it became, I think the global leadership at that point probably kind of felt that, okay, it's despite all our affairs and love for Myanmar, we can't ignore something as huge as something like a genocide. So the people, the community, they fled from persecution and they were tortured. When we went in, it was just a couple of weeks after they were starting to come to Bangladesh. We had so many people that we saw with signs of physical torture, and we met so many women and girls and community men who had been traumatized. So my first visit, again, this is the story I wanted to tell you. We had started the food distribution and we had started providing the package and assistance. But as I was going from one group to another, from one camp to another, we hardly saw the young people, the young women, and we hardly saw the young girls, and they were far away. And it took me a little moment to realize that in their community, in their society, women are kind of kept at the background. But also, we had not necessarily approached them for what they needed. And as you know, that reproductive health and menstruation, this is not something that stops with emergency. This is something that comes regularly. And these the provisions were not necessarily there, and it's so important to think about what is needed. It's about access to water, it is about access to the toilets and the sanitary pads and so on. So it just, that moment, you know, by going in there and talking to some of the women and not seeing most of them, this realization again reminded us that the approach ActionAid has of putting women at the center of emergency approach is so critical. I mean, and then of course I will also state the obvious, that women play a vital role in the care work for the family. You know, they are responsible for bringing the water, they're responsible for cooking the food, they are there to provide, you know, they take care of the sick and the elderly, the children. So it is so important to have, to understand what is it that the women need if they are in an emergency, because they have been dispossessed, they have been dislocated, they are, in the case of the Rohingyas, they were coming to a different country, they were in another country. And I must appreciate that the host community in the initial weeks, they just opened up their homes. They invited them, they supported them, because it takes the government machineries a certain amount of time to get mobilized and go and support. And the UN agency also needs time to come and approach. So it was just the community who supported them. So one of the reasons we feel that women-led emergency is so critical is because of the needs, both the strategic needs as well as the regular needs that they have. And also, if you study the response, which is led by women, we found that it's economically and socially, culturally much more effective. And you know, the sufferings and the cooperation among women actually helps the whole family to deal with the trauma and the conditions they are in. So it is so critical to have women-led emergency. And this is not just for the Rohingyas, but this has been our experience across all disasters. In the case of the Rohingya community, you know, first when they came, they were just fleeing persecution. They were just running away from being butchered and being killed and raped. When we went back a couple of weeks later or a month later, the first thing they said is that finally we feel that we can rest. We can sleep at night. We don't have to think about being picked up or being raped. And most of the women that I met had more than 5 or 6 children, because the community felt this was a false solution. This was a perspective that if the women and the young girls are pregnant or have a child with them, then they might not be sexually harassed. They may not face rape. But that's not true. We know how it was otherwise. It's 3 years now since the Rohingya refugees, this influx, and working with women and women leading on some of these responses has been very effective. They, as I was saying, that they are the caregivers, they are at the center of the family, and they are providing multiple supports. But the women also are very keen to live a dignified life, and therefore they want to learn skills. They want to be part of economic activities. They want to be able to get a livelihood. However, having said that, we created the women-friendly space. We created spaces for children, and the women started coming. The initial months were about the trauma, being able to share, the solidarity among women, one woman talking to another woman, or even non-Rohingya women being there, just listening to them. That meant a big thing. And the trauma that they had experienced, if they could speak about it, it helped in some certain ways. And then as the women started expressing themselves and wanted to lead on some of these issues, we saw how effective it was. But unfortunately, the patriarchal culture in our societies, the power dimension, is such a barrier. It's still impacting on women's full potential or their participation. And if you have seen the videos, or if you've seen photographs, how congested the Rohingya camps are, it's unbelievable. Unless you're there, they live in a bamboo frame with it's like cubicles with bamboo frames and plastic sheets. And in just a small area, there are more than 800,000. So that's greater than the population of Bhutan, or it's greater than some of the population of some of the countries in Europe, the magnitude, and that is of which more than 60% are women and girls. So the numbers also are one of the reasons why we feel that women-led emergency is so critical. It's about the strategic needs. It's about enabling women and girls to live a life with dignity. And it is also about empowering them, because they suffered in multiple ways. And this initiative of being a part of the emergency response returns to them a certain sense of dignity. And they don't want to be just at the receiving end. It's not about charity. They are entitled. It was about their rights. They should have been protected in their own countries. Today we talk about them being displaced, and we talk about genocide. I want to emphasize slightly moving from your question, if I may, which is that the need to hold the Myanmar government accountable. And if we don't recognize the genocide, and if we don't hold them accountable, then what is going to stop another government, another military junta of persecuting ethnic minorities? So I'll leave it at there, and then I can, if you have other questions, I'm happy to speak.
Thank you so much, Farah, for sharing your experience and perspectives. Something I heard from both of you is it's not charity. It is about rights, and what both communities in who have suffered from these crises, what they're entitled to by virtue of that. So Imani does have a question. I want to give her the chance to ask it herself. So Imani, you can unmute and ask the question, and then we can dive into a response.
Thank you, Niranjali. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be able to listen in to this important conversation. So my question really centers around what does it look like when the very sort of positive approaches, women-centered approaches to development are shared around the globe. That's kind of the heart of the question. But basically what I wrote in there is So in addition to convening sessions like this, how do communities, social movements, and global formations work together to confront the systematic effects of racism, inequality, and patriarchy? So we've heard specific examples about work in Haiti and work with the Rohingya. But underlying all of the levels of inequality and patriarchy that have been sort of described or alluded to, there is a global framework, right? And so how do we lift up the great examples of success and kind of knit them together to combat inequalities at the root level?
Thank you, Imani, for that great question. Yolette, Farah, who would like to go first? I mean, I think Farah did start to answer that question in terms of hold the Myanmar government accountable. But let's go a little deeper.
Okay, so I take that as a cue that you want me to start. I think we are millions of years away from holding the global leadership accountable in terms of the gender discrimination. I'm so, all my life, that's where we have been putting our energy. But somehow we gain a few and then we lose a lot more. And it's always the excuse of the priority. We have to look at security issues, we have to look at terrorism, we have to look at emergency, we have to look at food security, and we have to talk about protection, but without bringing in this whole discourse with the nuances or with the sensitivity around what happens to women and girls, how they are getting disposed, how they are being exploited. And the same thing is true for the GDP-led growth, or if you look at energy, fossil fuel-based growth, it impacts on the communities who are being displaced, and it impacts women doubly, makes them vulnerable doubly. They lose their social cohesion. They have to move. They lose their livelihood. They're losing, Yolette had mentioned about agriculture. On one level, how agriculture is emphasized. Just after the COVID pandemic broke out, and for instance, in Bangladesh, the Prime Minister kept saying that, go back to the villages and make sure your food system, you grow everywhere, anywhere. So food security and agriculture were connected. But it doesn't necessarily mean the policy and the budget are also allocated towards that. So global leadership, coming back to the question, is in many ways influenced and controlled and supported by the multinationals, the different vested groups, the vested, whether it's the fossil fuel companies, whether it's the multinational food companies, and they do influence our global leadership and their understanding. So that is one dimension, and we need to talk about it and mobilize around it. The other is national governments are not accountable to its citizens. And citizens are not accountable to each other, because in a society that we live in, I would say in Bangladesh, my constant plea and my constant point of emphasis is stop celebrating violence and stop celebrating power over. Until we do that, we will not see the transformation we're looking for. And that's exactly where citizens and anyone who benefits from the system happily enjoys and doesn't question the system. And it ends up with us activists or women's movement or ethnic groups or race, other academics doing it. But truly, the entire citizen of a country, the citizenship not behind it, it's split. And I guess when we talk about community, it is not monolithic. When we talk about women, it's not monolithic. When we talk about young people, it's not. And these divides have helped to keep the system going. In fact, it's perpetuated it. So we really now need to go beyond, look out of the box and come up with solutions. I don't have them, but I think from discussions, from hearing all of you, we might be able to come up with something, and that we can run with.
Thank you so much, Farah. So much of that resonates for me with what's happening in the US too, where our government is not accountable to its people, and what you're talking about in terms of celebrating violence and those who benefit from that, continuing to advocate for existing power structures is certainly true in this country. Yolette, would you like to reflect on Imani's question as well?
Yeah, as I understand, a question is how the importance of alliances and the importance to work at different levels. For example, in Farah example, and I could say from Haiti response we get after Matthew or now with Corona, we try to we get a signature, staying in emergency. We had a signature. Our signature is development of local actors. It's women leadership, it's accountability. The accountability towards the community and putting women as actors. And when we are talking women as actors, it's these women, you know, living outside of the country, these women, illiterate women, these women supporting everything. And now working with these women, putting these women as actors. Now we get a network of women to the country. And this network of women is choose from these vulnerable women, and now they feel powerful. They feel they can be actor during an emergency. And what we build during Matthew, now we continue to build on during coronavirus, and they put an important role to raise awareness, to detect, to work on denial, to detect what's happening in terms of violence. And really, they feel empowered, and they try to be part of the national system. Because, you know, the current discourse was, when it is emergency, it's serious affair. It's not time to talk about gender. It's not time to talk about equality. And when you talk about women leadership, it's about discrimination. We said, no, it's about an entry point. It's about women protected can help community to be protected. And then the other side is the alliances. And within ActionAid for the recent years, help us through different countries, the 50 countries where we work, to make these women visible. This leader we worked with in our countries to make them visible at level of United Nations. As you know, in 2016, there is a humanitarian summit where they try to rework on the humanitarian system. And they get this declaration called One Humanity, Shared Responsibility. And that was the way, the place where together, where ActionAid to different countries, but also ActionAid with others to influence this summit, exactly to say response to emergency. We need to develop local capacity because people should be able to help themselves. And that's what's happening. Farah just mentioned that earlier, and that happened in Haiti after the earthquake, during Matthew, and now in coronavirus. But now it is local. This idea to get people coming and to say, that's the way we need to organize. We are the one of the experts in emergency, no longer. Now in this declaration, no longer. They are talking about localization. They are talking about developing local resources and to get solidarity and to get support with others where there are gaps. We get this one at global level, and that helps to tackle racism because, of course, in general, this assistance after emergency is marked with racism. It's marked with inequality. You get white, big men coming and imposing their position on poor country and people in most vulnerable situations. Look, we try to tackle this at two levels, as I said, at community level, to get women to get their voice, to be heard, and to get them to be part of the national system, to become actors. And we join others, as you said, to try to change the global system. And I could say today, we don't have, at the humanitarian level, still they continue with the traditional aid. people coming and they say how to save life. But still we get this tool, we get this declaration, we get this resolution. ActionAid work hard on these two in terms of valuing women, valuing local organization, and this idea even about money. We're talking about grand bargain. We are talking the Church of Changes signed by different organizations to operate in emergency situation in another way, taking into account racism and tackle a patriarchy and all these concepts that return us to enjoy our rights. For me, I don't know if I am one, but that's the way I understand this point, how we use some global framework, and at the same time, we need to stay connected and to do clearly our work at national level too.
Thank you, Yolette. So great insights there. Caroline, there was a question from you. Go ahead and unmute and ask.
Sure, and sorry, I can't seem to get my camera to work, but thank you both. Thank all three of you for your insights on the panel today. My question for both for both Farah and Yolette was, how is climate-induced migration factoring into the context for both of you?
Thank you so much. We got a great picture of you though, even though you can't get the video working, so that's great. Farah, Yolette, who would like to go first?
Yolette, shall I speak?
Yes, Farah.
The whole climate change, you know, some of us, the countries that we come from, are highly vulnerable to sea level rise, to climate, to flood, to cyclone. So it has displaced the communities at multiple levels, and to survive, just to survive, they had to move. So there's been migration because of sea level rise, river erosion. This year, we have had COVID, Cyclone Amphan, 4 rounds of flood already. And we still have November, December, which is a cyclone. So the migration then is there. And the impact of this migration is A, the loss of social cohesion. They lose their community, they come to uncertain wherever they are able to move. They don't have an insured income or livelihood to take risk. Girls are at a high risk of child marriage. There's trafficking, and then there's also the sexual and harassment, and you know, the vulnerability index keeps going up and up for the entire family. But it has a gender dimension, and therefore women and girls are at a higher risk. And some studies are being done because it took us a long time, as most of us, the academics and the policymakers, enjoyed arguing, which is climate-induced migration, economic-induced migration, but we were still talking about humans, and we were talking about their vulnerability. Anyway, now it is possible to attribute the migration, which is as a result of climate change. I don't know if that answers your question, Caroline, but.
Thank you, Farah.
Yes, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Yolette, would you like to weigh in as well? And if you can, turn on your video.
Yes. Not to be long, look, I am in the same line than Farah, because in our country, it's not, we cannot say it's in a priority a climate-induced migration, but for sure that has an important impact. Because as I mentioned earlier, we said we are an island and we are very vulnerable to climate change. And talking about agriculture, and the majority of the country still now is not urban but rural. Yeah, there was a wave of migration toward the cities first in search of job. But as you know, because of the state, to go to the state, we get out the boat people, different waves of boat people, taking a lot of risk to cross the sea to get the state and to get Miami in general. And you know also all the discrimination, how Cuban are received and how Asian are received, good people. And same things, because they cannot get something from the land. Every day, every year, the land is eroded, and they go to Dominican Republic, and again, and now, you know, Asian in Florida, they are still working as farmers. They are still working as workers in the farm. In Dominican Republic, same thing, because they are losing their land, because they can no longer live from their lands, and they are going to Dominican Republic, where and that's exactly the fact. They are continuing to work as workers or farmers in this country, and clearly that shows it's because the condition in the country are in this situation of degradation, and that continue. But with Corona, clearly we didn't, there was a change, I could say, because when Corona happened, of course, people feel more secure in the countryside than in the cities, and they went to the countryside. And as you know, the situation was in the state or in Dominican Republic, and border was closed, and there was a wave of people coming back to Haiti from Dominican Republic. But at the same time, that's it, growing power, growing hunger, because coming back, there is no way they can continue to grow their land because of drought, because of lack of irrigation system. And clearly, the impact is attacking us at different level. That's the situation.
Thank you so much, Yolette. We have time for one more question. Ayushi, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. So my question is broadly around how we can rebuild systems better with a stronger emphasis on women empowerment programs, and more specifically in a situation of such emergencies where we see layered inequalities. How can we better plan for both short-term as well as long-term women empowerment programs? Because we see that some needs become more urgent as compared to others. So I'm just wondering how we can prioritize better in order to rebuild these systems better. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Who would like to take that one? Farah, do you want to take a stab at that?
Okay. Ayushi, I think it has to be seen in a time span. You know, like I was saying, that when we started working in the emergency response, there was a lot of gaps, and we have moved a long way from there in terms of influencing and working with the local authorities. So the longer term planning has to be in terms of both response and development work, and investment in women's leadership and capacity and so on. And it can even extend beyond just the capacity building of the women in groups. We found that we had to work with the ministries. We had to go and discuss even something like the shelter, how the shelters where people would take refuge during flood or cyclone was not gender sensitive. It did not have adequate lighting. It didn't have separate, wash facilities. The water point was too far away. So it meant that we had to do sensitization among ourselves, with the development partners, as well as with the government and the local authority. It takes time, but when you come to Bangladesh today and you see the shelters, it is so different from what it was in 2007 and 8, because prolonged influencing. In 2007-8, when we provided sanitary pads in the response humanitarian package, a lot of the men put it on as a mask, because the community doesn't necessarily use sanitary pad. They have alternatives. They have indigenous methods to deal with it. And today, you know, we see COVID and the mask, but that's exactly what happened at the community level. So again, we've understood that we need, along with what we provide, we need to do sensitization. There has to be community awareness, community empowerment, as well as women's empowerment. They are connected. It will not happen otherwise. And today, across the country, sanitary pads and hygiene kit are provided. It's expected that this would be a part of the response. So this is, maybe I'm giving you too long an answer, but the empowerment does not have overnight. And the short-term response is the immediate need, water. But when we talk about immediate need, it still stays at the level of water and food. It should not be. It should be water, food, hygiene kit, washing soap, and food for the children. Because that should be how the package should be done. In terms of midterm, we need to have capacity building and so on. And in terms of the longer term, it's about all the policy influencing.
Thank you so much. Yolette, I just want to check if there's something you would like to add.
Said everything.
Farah did a comprehensive job. All right, there's another question I did want to take really quickly from Brenna. I think we have just enough time. Brenna, will you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. So I just wanted to know what it is that we as individuals can do from here, from the United States, to help with this situation, help to make things better. What are the kinds of things that we can do to engage?
Great. This is the perfect lead into a little exercise we'll do after this is done. Yolette, would you like to start on this one?
Again, for me, I insist on it's about solidarity. It's not about charity. And solidarity goes in both sides. And solidarity means to listen to what are the needs, and what it needs in terms of concrete needs, but also needs to feel a citizen, to feel you can develop your potentiality. Clearly, that's a fight we are doing as ActionAid and some few others to get an approach where effectively we respect people, we respect dignity of people, and this idea we bring some support to people because they are in needs, they are in real needs, but at the same time to try to open the door for them to become citizens and to play their role. Today in Haiti, they are during Young Month, and some people in the diaspora circulated a letter to ask to stop silence because they are killing people in the poor neighbor. They are killing students in the university. They are imposing us, you know, without any retenue, I should say, priority. Now they said should be about election, should be about constitution. It's not what the country is asking. The country is asking for deep changes in the system, for people to feel they can live in their country. Look, we need this solidarity, and this solidarity is just to say we need to know about information. We know what is happening. We are in solidarity. We need Asian people to be heard. And of course, this kind of work we are trying to do, and where we try to help people to raise their voice, when we try to support people in dignity, when we try to support people where they want us to help them and they can build on instead to be powerless, and mainly women, that's what I think. That should be, of course, some money to support the kind of work we're doing, but it also to get information and to share the right information about what's happening. Because as I said, it's a small island. We are close to USA, but at the same time, we feel so isolated.
Thank you. Farah?
All that Yolette has said, and I would just add that since our conversation, or you invited me to talk about the Rohingya, and please keep this on your agenda. Please ask your leadership to remember, not to forget about, okay, so tomorrow we have another emergency and move in. It would be very sad to see a repetition of what's happening to Yemen. Even worse, what's happened to Palestinians, you know, in the long run. So we don't want to go down that path. Please, every individual can hold its representative, its leadership accountable.
Thank you. Yeah, I was reflecting on what you were saying, what both of you were saying, and it strikes me that there's the standing in solidarity and respecting the needs from the ground, what's being articulated from the ground, instead of putting our own lens on what we think is needed in the crisis, to really listen to leaders from the communities and what's happening at local level, but also to spread information, to share information more outwardly so that more people are aware of what's happening, and there is that communication flow. And then this last piece, Farah, that you were talking about, which I think is so important, is to stay invested in the struggle, right? And not just go with the new thing that's coming up, to remember that these crises don't go away overnight. They are protracted, they are long-term. And so we need to keep our attention and focus on those, even as new crises emerge, rather than leaving them behind to address a new crisis. So thank you so much to our speakers. I feel like I learn something new every time I speak with you both, and that's certainly true of this session. We're going to close out with a small activity. Again, we're going to go back to word cloud. So there's going to be a link that comes in on the chat. And what we'd like to know from you, all of you on the call, on the webinar today, is what actions you are inspired to take after this webinar. We heard a lot of information from Yolette and from Farah. They've also talked about ways in which we can be supportive. So this is a chance to articulate what you are inspired to do, and to perhaps practice a little personal accountability in terms of how you might take action. So take a minute and go ahead and let's see what comes out of the word cloud. Great, there's some really good things we're seeing up here. Donate seems to be the one that's coming up most strongly, and it was certainly one on our last webinar as well. Fundraising at work, but also connection, having conversations, sharing on social media. Oh, dismantle the patriarchy. Good one. Lifting up voices of women, holding governments accountable, gender responsive public services. I saw that up there for a moment. Learn more. Yeah, that's a good one. I was on a webinar recently where it was a whole bunch of lawyers talking about movement building. And one of the things that came up was definitely to listen more, and to listen for the purpose of understanding, which I think is certainly true of how we would like to approach addressing crisis, is to really listen to those who are most affected, to understand where they're coming from, and to address the needs that they are articulating. Solidarity, great. Wonderful. I always love these. I love what people come up with for these. All right. Before I close, I want to give Farah and Yolette a last chance to reflect on anything that came up in the conversation or in the word cloud that we just did. So a few final words. Yolette, perhaps you can go first.
Yeah. In my introduction, I said yesterday, they commemorated 10 years of cholera in Haiti, and it was great. There was an interesting event. It was a court, a popular court organized to judge minister. Like, it was wonderful. For me, it was this example of people starting again to mobilize themselves. Because I think we need to continue to fight, never surrender, even the context, and this idea to continue and to start again and again. And to be with you today also helped me to feel this connection and to feel, to get this feeling, we are these people who committed to fight and in solidarity. Thanks for this.
Thank you, Yolette. You have such a skill for slogans. It's like never.
No.
Farah.
If I may, two things. One is keep the Rohingya issue on the agenda. And, it was Gambia who took it to the International Court of Justice. And they're far from where the Rohingyas are, but they have their own history and experience, and therefore they took it up. So now it has gone to the court, and it's going to be a long process, but globally this has been recognized and acknowledged as a genocide, and even Myanmar government, Aung San Suu Kyi had to come to Hague to respond. Whether she said what we wanted to hear or accept the crimes committed is a different issue, but that process so we can all pressurize and in our solidarity for the rights of the Rohingya people, we can do that. And I want to end by, I think we should be careful. We don't want to build back better, because we don't want to go back to the system and all the gaps and holes and problems that we have. We want to build different. I think, we got caught in that paradigm and slogan, build back, resilience and build back better. And go back to what? Go back to all the discriminations, all the disparities, inequalities, injustices? No. So we want to build different. We want to build a different world and transform.
Fabulous. Thank you, Farah. It's such another great slogan. But yes, it's certainly true as I think about the conversations in the US about the social contract and what does democracy mean. And I often reflect on how the democracy was imperfect and the social contract wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be to start with. So it's not about
democracy.
It was
malocracy. I always call it malocracy. It was never democracy.
It was never democracy. That's right. That's right. And so it is about building different. It is about a different vision of the world and pushing that vision that we want in the world. So just going to end here. Thank you so much to Farah and Yolette for taking the time to be with us today and providing your experience and your insight. Thank you also just for all the great work that you're doing every single day. I mean, we get to see you and hear you talk about this, but really living all of these things you're talking about in your tireless work on a daily basis. So thank you for all that you do for the world.
Thank you.
Also, yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to us and connecting and reaching out. It inspires us. I am sure Yolette will agree.
Yes, definitely.
It gives us the strength.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for those of you who have attended. Thank you for taking the time I know that time feels crazy right now, but I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and your enthusiasm and excitement and willingness to join this movement in whatever way that you can. And I would appeal to all of you to pay attention and stand in solidarity with the global community. Your support is what enables groups like ActionAid to do this important work that we keep doing. So, you know, keep an eye out for all the ways in which you can be supportive of all the various things that we're doing, and you know, keep in mind that your support is urgently needed for communities at the front line of climate change, for communities at the front line of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, of dealing with crises that have been protracted, like in Haiti, as well as in Bangladesh with the Rohingya refugees. So whether it's a one-time donation or a monthly sustaining membership, every little bit helps. And thank you so much for considering supporting ActionAid. I also want to thank Jenna and Sophia for doing the behind the scenes work to organize all of this. Jenna in particular for herding everybody and getting everyone on the same page. Thank you so much. You're doing fabulous work. And last couple of things. Look out for a follow-up email. There will be a survey. Please fill it out. This webinar series is an experiment for us. So we would appreciate all the feedback we can get to make this as good as we can, and as a lesson for us moving into next year, where we might try to do more of these. And stay tuned for our third and final webinar of this series, which will be taking place in a month or two, which also promises to be a very insightful and exciting webinar. And also, before we leave, I wanted to let everyone know that we have also launched a series of communications work on democracy, reflecting on the state of democracy in the US. And also we hope to draw from experiences in the Federation and share words of wisdom from our colleagues. So keep in mind, this is such a pivotal moment in the US, these next 2 weeks, but also the weeks that will come after as we fight for a fair political process. And with that, I bid you all a good morning, afternoon, night, wherever you might be. Thank you so much for being with us, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thank you very
also.
much. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.